Hello, and welcome to another edition of Writing in Cars with Researchers. I'm Dr. Jeff Kingsley, and I'm here today with Dr. Andrew Pippas, an oncologist and good friend of mine. And Dr. Pippas has been doing research for quite a bit of time now, and we get a chance to peek behind the curtains and find out what makes him tick and why he does it and all of that. So Dr. Pippas, I greatly appreciate you taking some time.
My pleasure, Jeff. Good to see you again.
How long have you been doing research now?
So I began clinical research in 95. So I left Duke at 95, and then I went to a practice in Central Florida, and we did some clinical research there at a clinic there, and then the hospital began to do clinical trials in cancer, and that really got me excited because we had the chance to do some good phase 2 studies that led to the approval of several drugs, and the hospital then supported it greatly, and so that made me realize that you could do great clinical research away from academia, and that's how I got into it. So
why do you do it? Healthcare itself is getting harder and harder. It's hard enough just to be a physician. Why do you take on that extra challenge of adding on research to your practice?
Well, I think it's in some ways for an oncologist almost an ethical responsibility.
Yeah.
And not to say that other forms of medicine don't do great things at the cutting edge. They all do. I mean, cardiology clearly pushes the envelope. Infectious disease is always looking at new and better ways. Every discipline does. But if you look at how we've made strides in oncology, and you look at the strides we've made, particularly in pediatric oncology, but even adult oncology, all of those major strides have been made by committing patients and patients committing to being on a clinical trial. And I think that it's a fundamental responsibility, actually, for practicing clinicians of all stripes, academic, community, to be engaged in research in some way. It's part of your calling.
You know, I'm wired the same way. There's actually a journal article that's on our webpage. It was in an ethics journal about the moral obligation of physicians to participate in research.
Yeah, I do think it's a bit of, not to say that people that don't do it are unethical. They aren't.
Right.
But that's my view of it. And there may come a point late in my career when I will turn this over to the younger hands. But even then, I still think that if you're taking care of patients, you need to focus on something that's at the cutting edge. You have to be at the cutting edge. It may not be 1,000 cutting edges, Jeff, but it's got to be a couple where you are doing basic translational research, looking at new ways to treat people. I believe that fundamentally.
Yeah. Okay, so the patient perspective. Why should patients participate?
If you look at the major guidelines in cancer care, the guidelines in the United States, the NCCN guidelines, or the ASCO guidelines, or even the ESMO guidelines, all of them recommend and say they believe that the best cancer care for a patient is enrollment in a high-priority clinical trial. NCI sponsored, but not necessarily, just a high-quality clinical trial. Best care. Not good care, best care. So when you have organizations like that, Jeff, that look at it and think that the best care can come from enrollment, you've got to percolate that to what you do, and that's what I believe. I mean, I think if we had the right clinical trials for patients, honestly, I think everybody in some way should have an opportunity. They may not say this is for me. They may have bias against it, but at least the opportunity to say, I was offered a clinical trial, looked at it, I'm all for it, or that's not the way I'm wired.
Now, I think what you're describing, though, is different from what we read in the lay press, in newspapers, in not in medical literature, but what I typically see or perceive is that research is when you run out of all other options.
Right.
When you've tried everything else, research is your last choice. What you're describing is the opposite.
It is, and I think that particularly in medical oncology, particularly for illnesses that are difficult to treat, patients with a primary glioma, patients with an advanced malignancy, where we may have some drugs that work very effectively. We need to look at those agents and look at those trials and look at those situations and say, can we do better? Are there ways to do better up front?
Right.
And even in the settings where we have established very good therapies, for example, in stage 3 colon cancer or early stage breast cancer, even there, there are nuances in the way that you treat those people. And not only the treatment part of that, Jeff, but even after treatment, when you look at survivorship, late toxicities, the psychosocial, the emotional toil of treatment, those are opportunities for investigation, quality of life, survivorship studies, and the NIH is looking at that. We're looking at that here in Columbus, as you know. We're looking at the toxicity studies. We're looking at how chemotherapy affects fertility, for example, in premenopausal women. And we're looking at other studies that look at how we can modulate toxicities of treatment. So I even then, in areas where we have established treatments, we can make things better.
Right. Okay, so you've been doing research, clinical research, for a very long time. And today, we're talking about, in certain cancers, the ability to do treatment without chemotherapy whatsoever. The ability to just simply modulate your own immune system. Talk about the changes that you've seen in how we care for patients in oncology.
So you hit the nail on the head. I mean, in the last 5 years, there has been a revolution utilizing what I call the third arm of treatment. So the first arm, of course, is surgery. The second arm is chemo. And the third arm is the immune system. And even though we've talked about and used immunity in some ways, almost like a crude tool, like a bludgeon almost, we're now using it like a surgical tool.
Right.
And we, pharma and investigators that have looked at the modulation of PD-L1 or PD-1 or other ways to modulate T-cell activity, we now have drugs now that inhibit the brake of the immune system and allow the immune system to begin to activate and recognize cancer as a foreign entity. And we're now beginning to realize that modality works in a variety of tumors, almost all cancers to some degree. We're looking at ways to predict in whom that's going to be a treatment a modality and it's going to be a useful treatment modality. But clearly now, with the activation of the immune system using inhibitors, there are ways to treat cancer that are non-chemotherapy based in the standard way we think about chemo, that are highly effective. And you look at a disease like melanoma, for example, where you see response rates in the 50% range or greater, and durable responses, even with single therapy at 30-40% at 3 years in an advanced setting, just on the basis of monoclonal antibodies that modulate the immune system. So that's where we are with those agents, and the challenge will be in the future learning how to couple those immune drugs with chemo, or to couple them with other forms of biological therapy like tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and make sure that those are tolerable first off and more efficacious as standard of care. So that's going to be a huge series of clinical trials, hundreds of clinical trials, that'll begin to modulate the immunity even further.
Can you envision a world where chemo goes away completely?
I can. I mean, I think chemotherapy will always have its place in some ways. I think that chemotherapy is still an extraordinarily effective modality for many forms of early breast cancer or certain forms of breast cancer, colorectal cancer. It's still an active modality in other forms of GI malignancies, like pancreatic cancer. It's still an effective form for a variety of GU tumors like testicular cancer. And I think that even lung cancer, which remains the leading cause of cancer death in the United States, chemotherapy still has a role.
Sure.
Absolutely. So I think that it will have a place, but how we modulate it or connect it with immune therapy is going to be the next series of great big clinical trials. And we already have answers like that in lung cancer.
Right. And now, what about CAR T?
So CAR T is an important way to modulate signaling through the CD19 receptor. It's a way to dramatically activate T cells to recognize an idiosyncratic cancer cell in cancer patients. And clearly it's come to the market and is active in forms of leukemia, certain forms of relapsed lymphomas. It's been studied now in multiple myeloma, and will be in certain settings probably a form of curative therapy for people who have exhausted other options. its efficacy in solid tumors is being looked at and being studied, but clearly in the hematologic malignancies, it's going to be an effective treatment.
Mm-hmm. Can you imagine CAR T pushing into the community setting?
It's been discussed. Right now, it's been confined, Jeff, to mainly transplant facilities
Right.
that are familiar with the toxicities of reinfusing CAR T cells. When that happens, patients get this something called a cytokine release storm, which can be
Right.
difficult to manage. And so I do think it will happen in large community centers or referral community centers. We're part of a large community system, a large hospital system now. Would we look at that potentially? Would we affiliate with a system that does it more frequently than we do? That would be another option, I think, down the road.
Okay. So what advice would you give to oncologists that today aren't actively engaged in clinical research?
I would encourage them to look at it strongly. I would encourage them to begin to think about incorporating it in their practices and realize that the only way we're going to fundamentally be able to answer questions is to get everybody involved.
Yeah.
And that includes, that's everybody. And we hold it at the John B. Amos Cancer Center as a mark of pride,
Yeah.
Jeff, that we've been doing this for a long time. We think it differentiated us in years past from other centers near to us. We think it's a mark of quality care,
Yeah.
and we believe that strongly.
Any advice to oncologists on how to set themselves up for success doing clinical trials?
The thing I would tell you is get involved with an organization that's done it,
Yeah.
so they can educate you into how to get involved in clinical trials, how to get started. You can be successful at it, but don't go at it alone.
Right.
And make sure you have somebody who's done it, has a history of clinical research to help you.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that oncology is booming in the variety of trials that we have available, and the number of questions that we have to answer in immunology, immunotherapy are going to be increasing geometrically. I think that the combination of immune therapy and chemotherapy is going to be looked at more closely in a variety of cancers. I also think modulating immunity and adding drugs to the current drugs we have available to make them either more responsive, to make them to restore response for people who've had a response and have lost it. Clearly an area of interest for us. We have a trial looking at that, looking at ways of kind of resurrecting or restoring the immune system. And I think coupling biological therapy with immunotherapy is going to be huge. Again, the other thing I worry about in that setting are untoward toxicities or unknown toxicities. But as I said a little earlier, oncology is booming. The number of trials that are coming out in oncology is humongous. And I think that if you look at the number of trials in oncology, you could combine the other disciplines, or a couple of them, or three of them, and we still eclipse them.
All of them.
Maybe all of them.
No,
so
not kidding.
you know it better than I do.
Oncology is more than 50% of all the research happening on the planet.
So that's just we just need.
Yeah.
We just need our doctors and our hospital systems, I think, and our patients to be aware that these are the questions that are out there. They're important questions, and we believe that being involved in research is going to not only potentially be better for you, but be better for the folks that come after you to try to answer some of these questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's the responsibility we have as clinicians. Always looking. Is there a better way to treat this patient? Is there a study for this patient? And being in a position to have those studies available right here in Columbus.
Yeah. Yeah, everything happens faster. The more participation that we get, we can answer these questions faster. And it's important. I think probably there's a good portion of the audience that doesn't understand oncology research is so much more than just researching new ways of curing
Treating
cancer.
people. Oh, yeah,
treating cancer. It's diagnosing cancers earlier and more effectively. It's treating the symptomatology that goes along with chemotherapy and radiation therapy. It's so much broader than just.
You touched on a point that I And it is that. I mean, and it's finding better ways to diagnose cancer in a blood test.
Yeah.
It's finding out ways to image the breast better, maybe less frequently, but more proximally. Maybe we're not using mammography correctly the way we're doing it now. Studying that question. As you know, Jeff, there's a large study looking at that at the NIH. Not only, and then the treatment styles are very relevant, and then toxicity studies, and then after that, after it, quality of life afterwards.
Yeah.
How do we get people back on their feet? How do we get people back working? Those are things that we need to look at, and the NIH has taken an interest in that as well. These quality of life studies. So we fortunately have those available through our CTSU and CTEP affiliations. So I think all of that is very relevant. And for me, a successful patient, Jeff, is somebody that got into one clinical study, may have done well with it, goes on to another clinical study, may not do well with it, goes on to a third or fourth clinical trial.
Yeah.
That to me is a successful outcome of therapy or course of therapy for somebody if they need to go through that. So we think that, and we'll think that those studies need to be available through the continuum of cancer care, diagnosis, screening, treatment, radiation therapy if they need it, and then survivorship and long-term care.
Well, sir, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your impressions. Thank you for helping us revolutionize research and change how patients and physicians interact with research. It's so essential.
It is.
As always, follow us on social media. If you have any questions for Dr. Pippas, ask me. I will pass those questions on. We will get you your answers. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and I look forward to having you right along with me again in the future. Take care.